Okay. Wait one more minute as we're getting some more people entering the webinar, and then we'll get started. And we also have to have an answer to the trivia question too before we get started. For those joining, Eric has put a trivia question in the chat to see which WSEC cycle was the NFRC glazing testing first required for vertical fenestration. If anyone knows, put it in the chat. Undetermined if there's a prize for it.
I'm not seeing a lot of guesses come in. I'll narrow it down to a few years here, and then people can guess if they want to. Here, I'll give you
multiple choice.
Yeah, we'll make a multiple choice and see which era people think this one's in. There, I gave you six years to choose from. Oh, we got a winner. Patrick Merritt, 1994 was the year. Been doing it for almost 30 years, right? NFRC testing.
Theoretically.
Way to go, Pat.
Thank you. Thank you.
Okay, I think we can get started. We have some more people trickling in, but it's 12:05. Reed, are you going to be pulling up the presentation today? Okay, there we go.
Is that working?
Yes.
All right.
Okay. Well, welcome everybody. This is our second of the 3 webinar series that Rushing is holding on the 2021 Seattle Energy Code for commercial buildings. And let's go to the next slide. So today we're covering lighting, pieces of electrical, and the mechanical sections. And this is a overview, like we talked about last time, of our team leads from our miscellaneous departments. Eric and Andy will be kicking it off today, and then we'll be handing it over to Annie, our manager of lighting, who will then hand it off to Nick Rich, and we'll conclude today's session with Reed, Director of Mechanical. Next slide.
Did that work? Are you seeing the map?
Oh, it just was a little delayed. Yep, just turned. Thank you. Okay, and another recap, our Rushing, we have 7 studios. Please come to us for anything mechanical. Oop, looks like we just lost there we go.
Over here on screen.
MEP, lighting, energy, sustainability, and commissioning. We are primarily focused in the Northwest, but we're slowly expanding into other parts of the country. So, yeah, let's keep going. So I think we've already kickstarted this a little bit with the multiple choice question, but we want to test the chat box, make sure it's working for everyone. If any of you could please put your name, who you're with, if there's any questions or any specific topics you wanted to highlight today that you wanted us to talk about, please do so in the chat box right now. We'll give that another 30 seconds and then we'll get this kickstarted. Oh, it looks like David says not seeing any slides being presented. There we do have slides. Does everybody see slides? I'm seeing slides being presented, just making sure everybody can see that.
I see it.
Okay, and we will have the slides PDF'd and we'll be distributing those out as well as recording after this session. And we do have recording and PDFs of our first webinar, which was on November 30th. That's on our Rushing website, on our Mindshare, or you can email info@rushingco.com and we can email those to you directly. Okay, it looks like everybody can see the slides, so thanks for confirming that. Okay, so again, what we'll cover today, we're gonna kickstart with Eric, which is recapping the code development process. We're gonna recap the public meeting on December 5th, and Andy's gonna recap that for us. We'll then dive into the topics today for the Seattle Energy Code proposals that has to do with lighting, the renewables, some other electrical items, and mechanical. So with that, I'll hand it over to Eric.
Okay, so we're going to do a brief recap on what's driving code in Washington. We're going to hit a couple things we didn't hit last time. So if you were here last week, you don't have to totally tune out for the next 5 minutes. So 70% reduction in annual net energy consumption. So we're trying to create a code that can achieve that. We have a goal to have a code that has 0 fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions homes and buildings by 2031. And whatever we adopt has to be technically feasible, commercially available, and developed to lead the lowest overall cost to the building owner and occupant while meeting the energy reduction goals of the state. So got some pretty big goals in Washington that have some pretty big implications. Let's keep going, Reed. So we're behind schedule in the commercial code. We're looking for all great ideas to move things forward. We've gone through this process at the state level. In January, we'll see a report that tells us how far or how close we're getting to our goals. Let's keep rolling through here, Reed. And we have carbon emissions goals. The utilities are tracking for energy, electrical production to reduce carbon emissions for that. And we're one of the deep green states. We're typically one of the deep green states. So we didn't talk about this last time. So the federal energy code is 90.1 for commercial buildings. So that is what is required. The way this happens is when there's a new version of 90.1 issued, essentially the U.S. Department of Energy has 1 year to determine if the new version of ASHRAE is more stringent than the last version. And they do what's called a quantitative and a qualitative analysis on the code. And then they issue their determination reports. And so let's go to the next slide, Reed. So DOE, tracks the federal energy code, and essentially every state has 2 years once that DOE determination report is issued to show compliance with that. So they can either adopt 90.1 2019, or they can show equivalence with that via their own homegrown code, or via, we're using the IECC that's heavily modified. So our 2018 code was deemed to be equivalent with the ASHRAE 91 2019. So our 2021 code will be in compliance again. So that letter will go from the state to the Department of Energy saying we're in compliance. If you go back to the last slide really quick, there are a lot of states that are out of compliance. There are a lot of states that are moving into compliance. It's kind of an interesting federal requirement that we have. So we all know we designed to lead projects that are still looking at 90.1 2010 or 2013, but the federal energy code for the whole US is currently 90.1 2019. So let's keep going. Seattle's specific goals are to be 20% better than 90.1. So that for this code cycle is the 2019 version. To go net zero greenhouse gas emission buildings. That impacts not only new buildings being built, but how do we do that for existing buildings also? The Green New Deal said no fossil fuels for buildings, and then they're currently developing targets for the Seattle Building Performance Standards for long-term operational targets for buildings to reduce carbon emissions in those. So that's a current policy that's in development based on the mayor executive order from 2021. So those are some of the policies that we're tracking that are going on for Washington State and Seattle. So where are we at in the code process? Andy, are you going through this slide or am I?
I'm happy to talk to this one. So we touched on this a bit last week. We are entering a period of public meetings through City of Seattle. Dwayne Johnlin sent out schedules for that. We'll give a list, but essentially we've got targeted meetings for public comment and input. You're also welcome at any point to be submitting comments, suggestions, clarifications, etc., directly to Dwayne Johnlin. We'll include his contact information later on. That's going to be going on through mid to late January. And then once that's completed, Dwayne will go away and consolidate all of the great feedback and input, put together a draft, and then that's going to go to the Construction Codes Advisory Board, CCAB, for review and recommendations. It'll go to City Council. City Council votes to approve, and then the mayor signs the final code, and that has to sit for a minimum of 30 days before it'll go into effect. Current target is still to align with the July 1, 2023 Washington State date. I'm getting some background audio. If you're not speaking, could you please make sure to mute yourself? There we go. So that'll sit for 30 days before it goes into effect. Current target is July 1 or as close to that as possible. Don't count on things shifting more than maybe a month or two. So kind of what does the process look like? Jump to the slide, read. So there's kind of these public meetings going on, topic specific. Last week was the first session focused on envelope proposals. We're talking this week about the lighting and renewable/electrical proposals. Mechanical will be the following week. Starting in January after a little bit of a break for the holidays, talk about C406 and C407. Substantial building alterations, and an additional session for kind of, depending on how things go, if further discussion is needed, kind of a placeholder week. Could you jump back to the previous? Thanks. Oh, I'm sorry, we already said all these points on the previous slide, so never mind, let's keep going on through the schedule. So this is just a quick recap list of those upcoming public meetings. They are hybrid. There's an in-person option to attend at City Hall. There's also a WebEx meeting for folks to call in. So let's keep going. Here's just a quick recap of last week. We did an initial session with some high-level context setting overview of the state code changes to kind of set us a baseline for us as we start talking about the Seattle provisions envelope. Today, we're talking about recap of what happened in that envelope meeting. We'll talk about the lighting, renewable, and mechanical items. You're all going to get a little bit of a sneak peek. We've already double checked with Dwayne that we're okay to kind of talk through what's in the mechanical proposals before those get posted. And then in January, we'll do a combined kind of recap on things to date, and then talk about C407 energy modeling, C406 prescriptive compliance credits, and substantial building alterations items. So what did happen last week? Lot of good discussion. We gave a quick overview last time of what the proposals available were. Yeah, jump to the next slide. Thanks, Reed.
And by last week, you mean 2 days ago?
Oh, time, Eric. Yes, this past Monday, which I cannot believe was only 2 days ago. So, sorry, good clarification. So did talk through, there's a proposal for a mandatory 20% of all glazing on projects, vertical glazing, be triple pane or similar high performance option. Not something that would be tradable within an energy model or other things. We talked a little bit about intent for that proposal is to normalize use of triple pane glazing, get manufacturers up to speed, get contractors and others comfortable using the system. One thing that did come up during the meetings, there was some discussion about the U factor targets. The initial proposals were 0.24 and 0.28 for fixed and operable site-built glazing, so that'd be storefront systems, curtain wall, window wall. Some folks provided some commentary that triple pane, you can generally do a little better. Those targets could tighten up a little bit. So the current draft, I believe, is going to be 0.22 and 0.26. If anyone has additional input on that, do feel free to pass that feedback along to Dwayne as well. Talked through the glazing ratios changing by occupancy type. That's still on the table. High performance fenestration shifting to those same 20% target. So if you do exceed the glazing ratios for your occupancy type, you'd be triggering essentially triple pane type performance. But part of that glazing ratios by occupancy type was increasing the cap for certain building types. So high-rise office, multifamily would have a 40% cap instead of the 30 or 35% of previous code cycles. A couple other things that came up during discussion, how that's going to interface with existing buildings and substantial alterations. Some ideas thrown out about envelope commissioning. Doesn't sound like that's something that's going to make it into the draft. Bit of discussion about how spandrel performance for window wall, curtain wall systems is documented and calculated. Might see some additional proposals coming in around that. An option for reducing the vestibule exception for future retail spaces from 3,000 feet to 2,000 square feet. Doesn't sound like folks were excited about that scenario. And then also a good bit of discussion about embodied carbon. Not likely something that's going to be under the energy code, but potentially something for the building code. So stay tuned for more info there. So that's kind of what happened at that meeting, and let's jump into the lighting proposals. I'll kick it over to Annie.
Hi, I'm Annie, the manager of lighting over here at Rushing, and we're just going to briefly go over kind of some of the proposed changes for lighting. Next slide. So this is just a quick recap of what happened in the Washington state level or the last code cycle, just to kind of give you a frame of reference, because some of these changes for City of Seattle reference kind of what happened last year. So what we've seen current as we continue to see is just lower wattage allowances and higher efficacies required and more lighting controls. Next slide. So one of the changes for City of Seattle would be to take out the light reduction controls that was previously in the code and replace it with dimming controls. So things like instead of having, dual switching or switching of luminaires alternately, this would mean that several spaces would have continuous dimming required, along with a manual switch to require that continuous dimming, which really doesn't necessarily have a great deal of cost impact. Most LED lighting systems and control systems have that capability on board right now. So it's just more of an adjustment to how that's working in each space. Next slide. And the spaces are listed out here where this would apply. Of course, having the manual dimming switch may not apply or would not apply, proposed in rooms have other occupancy sensor controls, have daylight sensing controls, other controls. But these are just kind of a list of where this type of thing would apply. Next slide. In addition, our lumen power densities are reduced about 5% from 2021 Washington State Code, except for a few spaces where that lighting is really critical and you can't really reduce the wattage without reducing function. And it's about 5%, which is just kind of following the general trend of how technology is working. It's kind of LED technology kind of fitting in with, the code fitting in with where lights are more efficient these days. And we'll go to the next slide. And also a kind of a case of the code adjusting to where the LED lighting technology is there's an approximate average reduction proposed of 30% for retail spaces, and they're kind of broken out, as you can see on the slide, per type of retail. And, this seems like it's a huge adjustment and a lot less wattage to play with, but in fact, this is really kind of just following, it had been lagging behind a bit, and now this is just kind of evening up with the amount of efficiencies that LEDs are bringing to the table. Next slide. So just in general, kind of lighting design impacts that keep coming up and keep showing every code cycle is, power allowances and power densities are getting more and more stringent, and controls are becoming more and more complicated. And, with a lot of those combinations of things kind of pushing down on the lighting design, early and integrative lighting design is really critical to projects these days in terms of, getting the lighting designer on early to help to integrate with interiors and architecture, making sure that, the budgets of your job is balanced with your design goals and with what's allowed by code, and, using the expertise of a lighting designer to really work with your team to figure out how to balance all of those things, especially as the light usage, the power usage gets smaller and smaller and smaller. For instance, in this kind of bottom right-hand corner, this corridor originally was intended to be fully charcoal, and the lighting designer work with the interiors team and architecture team to change the materiality so that there be more reflectance available, so the light could bounce around and spread out, even though we couldn't use as much light. So we needed to find a way to make that corridor code compliant. So, just these codes mean materiality really matters early, and kind of making sure that that coordination happens to keep everybody working together to accomplish code. And that's really the main points for lighting. If I'll throw it over to Nick. Rich at this point.
Thanks, Annie. Hello, everyone. Nick Rich. I lead our electrical team here at Rushing, and thought I'd step you through some of the significant changes or impacts on the electrical side of thing. And starting with that, let's start with renewable energy. And just to get a little context on it, we'll start with the state requirements, and then we'll zoom in on Seattle. With the state, we have a new mandatory requirement for what was before was solar readiness. We have now mandatory requirements for renewable energy, whereas it was optionally referenced in the appendix for adoption by jurisdiction. The on-site renewable requirement now is 0.5 watt per square foot. Kind of keep that in the back of your mind, 'cause when we jump into Seattle, we'll talk about that a little bit more. And that is based on the entire conditioned floor area rather than just like the top 5 floors of the building. And we carry forward some exceptions for the shading and roof coverage. And for factoring in the C407, 406 offset, actually, Andy, I'll ping to you to touch on some of the new impacts.
Yeah, so mandatory on-site renewable energy requirement, but there are some options to offset that even if you're doing a prescriptive or an energy modeling pathway. If you are doing prescriptive, there's an option to offset your C411.1 mandatory requirement by achieving additional C406 credits. Or conversely, if you're doing a C407 energy model, there's an option to offset that with additional energy savings within your building performance factor. So the other thing that is a little bit new is C407, and we'll talk about this in January ahead of that meeting, but C407 has a new second metric for building energy factor. It's essentially a source metric. There is a new pathway to account for offsite renewable energy for both the C406 credits and the C407 compliance pathways, but that's not allowed for your mandatory onsite. So right now you have to provide that, use one of the exceptions, or otherwise offset via C406 credits or C407 energy savings.
Thanks, Andy. You can see that the focus really is on the quality of the renewable. You can see in this table the different renewable energy factors for the offsite. There's a lot more, it's more complex, but more flexibility in this. Okay, let's go to the next slide. And for Seattle, I was mentioning keeping in the back of your mind that 0.5 watt a square foot for Seattle. We're looking at 0.75 watt per square foot for the on-site renewable. The roof coverage exceptions basically just get refined from where we were before, a little more refinement of the mechanical equipment clearance requirements. And then for the solar fund, I think that's still yet to be determined just yet. Let's jump to the next. And for offsite, it is not available for meeting the, it's not tradable, for instance, with the C411.1, the mandatory on-site renewable. The offsite, as Andy mentioned, available as an option for the compliance with C406, the C407. And the potential renewable energy fund, if it is created, then that will likely be built into the Seattle, but that's still in process. Okay. So in addition to renewables, there's a couple other things we wanted to point out that were of interest and significant in the electrical realm. The first gets into submetering of our buildings. Additionally, for buildings, and many of which are impacted, for parking facilities over 3,000 square foot, we have the additional categories for these spaces, both for lighting and then the ventilation as well. And then finally, we probably saw this one coming. I think for those of you who have been in the realm and been aware of Seattle's requirement for the residential cooking, basically future provisions for electrification, this is being expanded for commercial kitchens too. So even where we've got gas-fired appliances, which obviously for commercial kitchens, highly desirable, highly popular, we will need to provide both service capacity and an electrical panel within that kitchen space or an adjacent room sized appropriately for future electrification. Okay. And with this, I think we'll come over to mechanical requirements, and I'll introduce Reed.
All right. Hey, everybody. So Eric and I are going to be covering mechanical changes. We're going to do a little recap at the state level and then move into what are some of the current proposals on the table for City of Seattle. Eric, you want to take us through the heat pumping at the state level?
Yeah, so big step forward at the state level. We're moving to electric heat pumps for space heating. This was highly controversial at the state level. A lot of discussion about natural gas versus electric use. As we know, Washington is a heating-driven climate. Our peak electrical loads do happen in winter, in the morning warm-up for buildings. So this is going to be a big shift. So state's very similar to 2018 Seattle, similar exceptions. So it'll look like your Seattle projects. Let's go to the next slide. So for domestic hot water heating, service hot water heating, again, we're moving towards where Seattle is in the 2018 code at the state. A lot of discussion here about types of heat pumps again. The state landed at a compromise position at 50% heat pumps sized for 40-degree outdoor temperatures. And then you're allowed to have either natural gas heat or electric backup for that. So obviously a lot more climate zones, different design day temperatures throughout the state than there is in Seattle. So a lot of discussion there. There was a lot of discussion about natural gas heat pumps for this application, but we landed on electric heat pumps for this requirement, 50% of the capacity. And with that, Reed, I'll kick it back to you for some Seattle changes.
So we'll start with a not so significant change in the city of Seattle. The heat pumping provisions are very similar to 2018 changes. There's a couple clarifications on electric heating allowances, and there's some language on the table to be able to trade off your electric heater allowance within a dwelling unit. So possibly one bedroom having larger windows than another or some other similar application, but overall, not so significant on that front. And then here's another recap at the Washington state level, what changed. There's been a lot of addition on fan power, and basically all of the changes were extracted from Title 24, and which is the California Energy Code. And basically designers are going to be having to pay a lot closer attention to fan power allowances, and there are large tables in the code for different system types that we'll all have to familiarize ourselves with to figure out what our allowable fan powers are. And then on the Seattle side, what's on the table right now is the small ERV fan efficacy requirements. Currently under 2018 and at the state level for 2021, the fan efficacy of 1.2 CFM per watts is what's current. There's a proposal to increase that to 1.7 CFM per watts, and then also expand that requirement from 1/12 horsepower fans to 1 horsepower fans. So that pushes us out of just single dwelling unit ERVs and pushes us into more mid-size kind of central rooftop ERVs. The large one on the bottom left wouldn't fall under that category, but so there are some impacts here. We're currently studying it with a handful of our vendors to see how feasible that fan efficacy is going to be able to be hit. I think there's going to be some conversation in the meetings with SDCI on where we land on these, but this could end up being a significant change. When you're really looking at fan power, the game that you're playing is, how much do you have to upsize your box and oversize your ERV to really hit those load numbers. So that's kind of something that's in progress and going to be a discussion point in the meetings.
And Reed, how big your duct needs to be traveling
and-
through the space, right? I mean, a good way to lower fan power is lower velocities in ducts. So.
Yeah. And so, yeah, if you're trying to reduce your static pressure to reduce your fan power, that's going to mean larger duct sizes for sure. And then once you get out of the 1 horsepower, fans, and you get into DOAS in between 1 horsepower and 1 kilowatt, which is like 1.35 horsepower, then Seattle's reducing the 1 watt per CFM down to 0.8 watts per CFM. So that's another current proposal on the table. All right, and a couple additional not so significant changes for mechanical. Group R2 ERV effectiveness is going to be increasing from 60% to 67% sensible. This matches the prescriptive requirements of the Title 24 Energy Code in California, which is where I'm assuming it got pulled from. Overall, we don't see major impact with the ERV efficiency from most vendors. The fan power is a little more limiting on those selections. And then there's also a proposal to incorporate the pump energy index, new metric that's proposed in the 2024 IECC, and pulling that into the 2021 Seattle Energy Code. So if there's any pump vendors on, I think maybe I saw Gary Fox, maybe I'll call him out if he's familiar with the PEI and if that's something manufacturers are on top of. I think we have a little bit of research on our end to figure out if there's any significant impact with that. Eric, you want to talk us through the occupied?
B&G is all over that PEI thing.
Yeah.
And has been for a while.
We figured if it was being proposed in the 2024 IECC that manufacturers would be on board.
Yeah, so one other change that's coming that's proposed, it's also I think out of the 2024 IECC is the occupied standby controls. So essentially in spaces that are required to have lighting, occupancy, vacancy sensors, that the mechanical systems would also have to set back airflow and space temperature control during unoccupied times. So this generally applies to office areas, conference rooms, those other type of spaces that already require occupancy sensors. So there's a little bit of work to do here with SDCI to craft the language to be enforceable with our DOAS plus space heating and cooling systems codes. So there's probably some intent that we're going to work it through in the meetings and over the next month on how to apply this and for different system sizes. Some of the exceptions are more written towards VAV and other systems that we're not using as much in Washington State. This could also be something that's triggered for existing buildings during office TIs and those kind of retrofits. So more to probably be learned about there as we get into this with the code development process in Seattle. So with that, we made it through the major content. Is that right, Reed? Looks like it.
That's it. We're wrapped on slides, but so we have plenty of time for questions. Feel free to raise your hand or drop it in the chat and we can answer some questions.
Or even if there's some questions from the previous session or something that's coming ahead, just feel free to ask whatever questions here.
or if you have a brilliant idea on how to save energy or a correction you want in the Seattle code, then those are good items to bring up too. So.
Hey guys, this is Tamara with Mortensen. Sorry if I forgot to mute at the beginning of the meeting, but question, I took a snapshot of your envelope meeting recap. And of course, 20% mandatory triple pane or similar. I noticed the meeting envelope recap, but is it going to happen? Because I got to go talk to some people about that sooner than later, because we have some stuff going in after July. So.
Yeah, I'm happy to chime in. Yes, that is still being maintained in the proposals. If you have any thoughts or inputs on what those targets are, things like that, do feel free to send that in, or happy to, chat offline if you have any questions you want to talk through in more detail, but you should plan on that making it into the 2021 Seattle Energy Code.
Okay, thank you.
I think Dwayne's on. Dwayne, if you have anything else that, if you'd like to respond to that or any other items, do feel free to chime in.
Thanks, Sandy. I'm certainly open to everybody's continuing suggestions. We had a good chat about that on Monday, and my intention is that in a future code cycle or two, we'd have maybe 80% require that, but this would be starting off with a more modest requirement so that you could pick, I don't know, the top floor or the north face or whatever you wanted on your building as the triple glaze section, and that this would start to normalize this for our local fabricators, so that when we go to a larger percentage that would be required to be high performance, that we would be set up to do that without a lot of economic impact.
And one other quick comment on that too is, Dwayne mentioned it could be maybe the top floor or one facade. You can also do averaging between systems. So for example, if you had a mid-rise building with punched openings and a storefront system, you don't have to do 20% of the storefront and 20% of the punched openings vinyl windows. It could just be you do 40% of your vinyl windows and it's 2 facades. Or another thing is there can often be significantly better acoustics. So maybe you've got particular noise concerns on one orientation because of a busier street. Like those are the types of things that design teams can consider when they decide where to place that partial portion.
Okay, the next question I saw, will any cost information analysis be provided by SDCI in regards to the changes in the 2021 Seattle Energy Code? So unlike the state process, Seattle's resolution to be 20% better than the 90.1 doesn't have any specific checks and balances for cost in it. I know Dwayne's always looking for the most cost-effective, commercially available, technically feasible ideas out there, but it is a much different resolution that the city of Seattle has passed in regards to their energy code. Seattle's been on the forefront of energy code development since since the 70s, and this is part of their mission. Is they know they're not going to build another hydroelectric dam, and 90% of their power comes from that, and so they are committed to growth within the city, but also moving the energy code forward. So I don't know if there's Dwayne's always looking for cost information if proponents are submitting stuff, but it's a very different process in the state. So the next question, how much will the ERV code changes limit equipment selection? Can most ERV vendors comply with this requirement with currently available models? So Reed, I don't know if you want to address this one. I can start, but yeah, as far as ERV effectiveness, it's really about surface area of heat exchanger. So getting to 60% sensible effectiveness, often means, selecting a 100 CFM box to do 50 CFM, right? It's going to a bigger box size. So yeah, they're commercially available. It's just you're going to be oversizing equipment to improve efficiency on the ERV side for effectiveness. As far as fan power, there's a lot to work through on the fan power stuff that Reed and I are kind of diving into the details of. We have reached out to several vendors to get selections, but some of it's going to come down to how the final code language is written, and we're working on some editorial comments to make sure that's clear and enforceable as to how those fan powers are reported and selected. So I think more to come there when we get to the final code language. Anything you want to add there, Reed?
No, I think you summarized it well. There's just some clarifications that need to happen. The 1.2 in the Seattle code for this 2018 code cycle, it was limiting based on manufacturing test data, and we did have to be careful about which ERVs we were selecting. When you look at just like a single residential unit ERV, those are really 110, 120 CFM ERVs, and code minimum ventilation is 45 to 65 CFM. So they are, oversized as is for for a single apartment unit. And so I think we will see some clarifications on the testing side, and you'll see manufacturers adjust their, what they publish for their fan power usage based on kind of what comes out of this, the final code language.
Okay, we have a question from Jeff Votes on, does Washington State Energy Code allow electric resistance heating in dwelling units? Yes, so there are similar provisions in the state code as they're in the 2018 Seattle code that allow for electric resistance heat. There's different allowances for Eastern Washington climate zone versus Western Washington. So yeah, and different types of rooms. And then Seattle's also working on some additional language to allow you to kind of average and trade off with multiple rooms within the dwelling unit. So you kind of get an allowance for your dwelling unit. You can decide how much heat to put in the living room versus a bedroom, for example. So that can more closely match, where you want to put glazing or other things on the project. And then there's a question on C411 mandatory renewables section from Ben Gazan. I haven't looked at that one yet, Andy. Have you looked at that one?
Yeah, so I'll just read the question real quick. So Ben asks, C411.1 mandatory renewables section, can roof coverage exceptions be used to reduce total wattage of renewables for a project, or does the target stay the same and force the owner to shift to offsite options if the roof's not large or otherwise constrained? Roof space is always a challenge between MEC and PV and zoning limits. Yep, that's a very accurate statement. So at the state code C411.1, it's explicitly on-site renewable energy. There is no reference back to C411.2 that does the off-site renewable accounting. So the exceptions in C411.1, there's some for like 50% shading from adjacent structures. There's one for 80% of roof coverage. And so then there's a exception 3 that's basically if you are using one of these exceptions to offset your requirement that you don't have sufficient area, you're supposed to, so if you don't hit the 80% threshold of the space coverage, that just lets you do an exception. You have to install a not zero amount of renewables. That was discussed a lot at the State Building Code Council tags. The other thing is then that kicks you down to another section that says if you use one of those exceptions, either the shading 80% coverage or less than 80% and install not zero amount, you have to offset that with additional C406 credits. So if you are doing a prescriptive compliance approach, you have to install something else to make up for more C406 credits, but there's nothing for if you're doing a C407 compliance pathway. And that's because there's already a source energy factor baked in to the C407 energy modeling pathway. So you don't have to offset the total requirement with offsite, but you do have to pick up more C406 credits or otherwise meet your building energy factor if you're doing a C407 energy model. That was kind of a lot. Did that answer the question, Ben?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, great.
And I think, you know, if we keep trying to design the same building, you know, we're never going to get to our goals. So obviously the code's going to require us to develop different mindsets around buildings. You know, should mechanical be on roofs or does it need to be somewhere else in the building? You know, we have to continue to reduce the amount of energy usage of the building, which reduces the mechanical system sizing. So all this is kind of working hand in hand, and we have to allocate some to electrical production, right? We're doing a lot of EV charging and a lot of other things that are going to require electrical usage in buildings. So it is an interesting puzzle we're all trying to figure out.
And just one other comment on that, Eric, is, you know, Ben, in your question, you mentioned, you know, all these conflicts between mechanical, PV, occupied roof decks, et cetera, and land use, building heights. But, you know, starting to then also think about, well, can we put any of these panels over certain portions of the mechanical equipment? And obviously that can be challenging with land use, but are there other options to progress that further? Or, you know, maybe a slightly lower production system that's integrated as a canopy and is also kind of, you know, an interesting part of the sustainability aspect and storytelling of the project, where it's a visible piece of, you know, maybe an integrated canopy over the roof deck, or, you know, starting to think more creatively. That's kind of goes back to that early integrative design is really kind of a common theme of 2018, 2021 and beyond energy code cycles. And I saw Phoebe had a question of, is there any proposal to require PV to shade otherwise uncovered exterior parking? Nothing explicit for that. Do we have a lot of uncovered exterior parking in Seattle? I don't know if it might be a suggestion, Phoebe, if you want to send a comment over to Dwayne, or
I know other jurisdictions have adopted that. I've seen that recently. So that is a good idea that's being implemented in other parts of the country. So, and it'll be a good stepping stone to get into the state code, which obviously outside of Seattle, there's a lot more uncovered parking. So.
A little bit different climate, but anecdotally, I used to live in Phoenix, Arizona. They do a lot of that there, and boy, do you really want to fight to get that shaded shaded spot. It's a particularly good system there, but definitely potential here as well.
So storage and use of generated power from PV systems. So do you want to talk a little bit about the load management credits at C406? And
yep. So we'll talk more in early January, but if you are doing a prescriptive building, C406 section C406 is a mandatory efficiency credits package section. Something new in 2021 is there's now 2 categories of credit. There's efficiency credits and load management credits required for new construction. Electricity battery storage is one of the options for load management credits. So that's one way that's going to interface for projects starting in 2021 for the state and Seattle. But just to clarify, that would be prescriptive option, nothing mandatory.
Unless Seattle makes it mandatory, unless somebody wants that.
Unless Seattle makes it mandatory. Good point, Eric. We've got about
that we know
4
that's proposed
minutes.
yet.
Yeah, got about 4 minutes left. Any other questions on topics today? Other items? Lots of really good questions. Thanks everyone for posting in the chat. Lots of really good questions and discussion. Appreciate all the engagement.
Okay, you want to do a recap of, and then we can close this out, Andy?
Yeah, sure. So just one more time, here's the upcoming public meetings for City of Seattle. A lot of really good, interesting discussion. So do participate in those if any of these topics are of interest to you or you have any input or insights to share. They are hybrid again, so you can attend in person at City Hall. You can also call in via WebEx. Few technical issues on Monday, but hopefully be a little bit more streamlined for next week. I was in the room at City Hall, but I heard anecdotally that once it was set up, the audio worked really well. So few good ways to participate in those meetings. The topics are broken out there. If you do have thoughts, input, Dwayne Johnlin, I believe that his quote is begging for ideas and suggestions. So do feel free to send any items to him there, contact info on the slide. And that's, I think, what we've got for today. So thanks everyone so much for joining us, participating. Really appreciate all the thoughts, input. Great to see folks here today. And stay tuned. We'll separately from those SDCI public meetings, we'll see you all again on January 11th to do a recap update and talk about energy modeling and prescriptive C406 credits in more detail. So looking forward to seeing you all then.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Great job, everybody. Bye.